Let's get started. Thanks everyone for coming. We have a honored guest today, Stephen Kelts of the University Center for Human Values. He has been doing a lot of work over the course of recent years on thinking about ethics, and in particular about thinking of ethics in technology, and even more specifically about an integrated CS ethics program. And this is something that we, the Department of Computer Science, together with CITP and together with, help from people like Stephen, would really like to get serious about over the coming years. And in particular, we would like to start really revamping some of our courses, hopefully eventually, most if not all of our courses, to include elements of the CS ethics curriculum. And so Stephen today is going to talk to us about how to take the first step.
Yeah.
Please.
Good. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for having me here. And as Simon said, I'm in the Center for Human Values here. I'm an ethicist, as they say, but I come out of a political science background. So you'll see throughout the course of the talk today that I take a bit of a different approach to ethics. I have studied, I understand the philosophy of ethics, but I take a behavioral philosophical approach to ethics. And a lot of the work that I'm about to talk to you about today is part of a scoping project that we actually started with Google like 5-6 years ago as they were building programs for their engineers in-house. And at the end of the presentation today, I'm going to tell you about a program that I run here on campus called Agile Ethics, which is built in conjunction with a program that they call Moral Imagination inside of Google. And I also want to preface this by saying what I'm going to present to you here today is not a vision about how to overhaul your course. That is not what this is about. This is about instead looking at the student life cycle of learning responsible innovation and allowing you to potentially think, if you want to incorporate some ethics or responsible innovation or AI governance components into your courses, allowing you to think about what might be appropriate. As you'll see in the middle of the talk, I'm going to present sort of a student life cycle, and you may want to think about where your students are at when they're entering your particular classroom, and whether one of these types of interventions or two on some small scale might actually help them where they are at. Okay. So, and if you do want today's slides, I'll send them around later as well. There's going to be a lot of QR codes by way of citation. And there's going to be a handout that I'm going to use later that'll be at this QR code. I'll give that QR code to you later as well. So, so it hardly needs saying some of the problems that have been identified within the past decade or more that are caused by large-scale, especially information communication technologies. Ruha Benjamin on our own campus has talked in her book, Race Out of Technology, about bias within machines. Surya Matu, also on our campus now, at least, worked on this machine bias, about the ProPublica article about the Compass recidivism algorithm. There's a Brookings study there about an enrollment algorithm being used across many schools that they trusted a bit too much to optimize enrollment numbers, but in fact, it was actually discriminating against poorer students when distributing financial aid. Right? It got the most freshmen to enroll, but then it didn't retain them because they hadn't told this algorithm to actually care about retention. Our own algorithm, Ryan, de-anonymizing data sets showing problems with privacy. There's the Microsoft Azure breach recently. Mark Zuckerberg being called to the Hill to talk about children's safety. The social dilemma a few years ago talking about potential harms to autonomy that come from some uses of technology, right? Now, as an ethicist, or especially as a behavioral ethicist, your first question would be about this would be, what's going wrong in these instances? They're probably all different. So it could be that some people don't know what's right. People often use the case of Clearview AI here. Huang Tan-Tak, the CEO of Clearview AI, is out there to this day defending their scraping of billions of images off of the internet, saying, well, these images were public, they weren't private. And so therefore training my algorithm on them was perfectly ethical, right? So people sometimes say, well, maybe this guy just doesn't know what's right. Another thing you could say is he's maybe just using a maladaptive set of values. That was the way we treated public and private 20 years ago, but maybe we actually need to update our sense of those values, right? There's a couple things you could take from that example. The biggest problem with assuming that someone might not know what's right is that it's a condescending assumption. And it's hard to intervene with anyone in a computer science classroom. The computer science students I had in my classroom, engineers, it's hard to intervene with anyone based on that assumption. You could also think in some of these instances, people know what's wrong, but they're doing the wrong thing anyway. People have said that about Mark Zuckerberg. There's a famous apology letter that he issued after he created Face Mash at Harvard, where he said, "Oh, I knew I shouldn't have done this, but now I'm reconsidering and I've taken it down." Right? That would seem to indicate that he knew what was wrong. There's a memo by Chris Bosworth from inside Facebook called "The Ugly or the Ugly Truth," in which he said, "Look, Facebook, we connect people. That's what we do. Even if we have facilitated violence, even if we have polarized politics in the sector, we connect people," right? And so he knew that wrong was occurring, but made a decision to pursue that wrong anyway, potentially in favor of another value, connection, if that's a value, I don't know. But the assumption I'm going to talk about today drives a lot of the work that I've been doing in the past 4, 5, 6 years, is that what's going on most often is failures of anticipation, right? Not having foresight, not actually engaging in good design, right? So if you assume good people placed in work environments that constrict knowledge and that don't support good decision-making, well, then what you have is bad design processes, right? And you can actually intervene in bad design processes, right? A favorite cartoon of mine about our study shows that most evil artificial intelligence is actually artificial stupidity. That's maybe a little strong word to use, but if you think of it just as poorly designed algorithms, not well thought through, well then, yeah, maybe most problems today are in fact caused by that type. And so one challenge you might think about in educating for responsible innovation is the challenge listed here. You see headlines about this all the time. When Tristan Harris talks about his work at Google, when Asa Raskin talks about his invention of infinite scroll, which eventually got worked into Instagram, they say the problems from this were unanticipated, right? So we see these words frequently in headlines: unforeseen, unanticipated, unintended effects. Right? Unforeseen would, to counteract that, would require some sort of foresight, the ability to envision results before they happen. Unanticipated, if that means something different than unforeseen, might mean actually being able to piece out the causal train that would lead from my actions today to that now foreseen consequence. In other words, to anticipate how it comes about. Unintended would mean I didn't want to do that, but that was what happens anyway, right? So to intervene in these instances, you would want actually to develop among engineers a set of skills where they could foresee, anticipate, and intend, right? Bring about products that they in fact that have the effect they intend to have. One solution that many people use is called a responsible innovation framework, right? And so these are people who are literally moving towards design frameworks. Like this is what we will actually do as the steps towards design within the company. This is how we'll allocate work. These are the studies that we'll do. And there's a QR code for that there if you're interested in taking a look at it. They break down all of these potential problems into 4 categories: anticipation of wrongs, reflexivity, that is being able to contemplate what those wrongs mean or what those potential consequences mean to you. You might not decide that they're wrong. We might have disagreement about that, as I'll say later. Being more inclusive, that is in order to counteract the problem of bias, and responsiveness. So not just knowing what users' needs are, but responding to them. Right? Feeling the pull of those needs to some degree. If you look across all this literature on responsible innovation frameworks, I think these are the themes that really emerge. That the shape of the solution comes out as foreseeing consequences, anticipating consequences, reflecting on those consequences, and deciding whether for you and your team those are bad consequences or not. To me, I honestly don't care if Hong Kong Pat has reflected upon it and decided that he thinks that was the right way to go with Clearview AI, so long as he's anticipated, foreseen, and reflected upon those consequences, including people. Right? being able to intend, which the moral psychologists think of as an actual skill, right, is different than behavior. It's about sort of deciding internally to take an action. And then again, responding. So if you had a solution that was sort of the holy grail for responsible innovation, it would be a solution in which engineers and all of the people they work with, marketers, CEOs, product managers, etc., in which they were aware of short and long-term consequences, in which they were cautious in the face of the unforeseen, in which they thought with and among a diverse group of people. They tried to get diverse perspectives, and in which they were ethical, and in this sense means not making the ethical choice, but ethical reasoning, right? So they should be able to reason about social impacts of their tech with strong arguments in order to form the intention what to do. If you thought about this as a student journey, right, to these skills, right, and some organizations, ABET, in their accreditations, have various different skills listed that are supposed to be taught in courses. ACM, well, I'll get to that example soon, right? So you can think of these as skills acquisitions that an engineer or a computer scientist might want to have. You could start them with cases so that they're aware of the past, labeled cases. As we'll see in a second, that is good, important, should be aware of the past, but really not quite enough, because what they're actually going to encounter in their professional careers are unlabeled cases. Instances of new technologies for new users that might have new effects. So the second thing is to get towards a skill of issue spotting. And then for the ethicist, that is the philosophical ethicist, they might be concerned mostly with or solely with step 3, which would be reasoning about those things. Can you give strong arguments in order to form intentions about those things? Philosophical ethics usually doesn't even care about intentions, it really just cares about reasoning, one part of the ethical process. The fourth part really, and the students say this, as I'm going to get to in a second, they say, if you're going to do these ethics interventions with us, A, don't condescend to us and think that we don't know what we're doing or how to think about these things, but then B, what does this have to do with the technical skills that I'm learning? How would I deploy the skills I'm learning in this class in order to mitigate this problem that an ethicist has come in here and told me about? So the tech solutions that they'll need. And then, as in the ABET standards for engineers, the work of a computer programmer occurs within a complex working environment, and they are all different. Facebook is different than Google, it's different than whatever. So you'd also want to inform people along the way about some of the challenges that they might face within a workplace, as there are pressures of money and hierarchy and command and information as well. You might not always know what the other members of your team are doing, right? So you might want to inform them about some of those obstacles, right? So from knowing that problems have been caused to knowing why those problems were caused in the past, that's what you actually got to know, because you're not going to see the same problem. You're not going to see the same choice that Zuck faced in 2000, whatever it was, when he created FaceMash and then Facebook. It's not going to be the same. So from knowing that to knowing why, to knowing how to do something about this is the life cycle or the sort of student journey that you would want for responsible innovation. Right? Why is now the time to think about this? Well, for computer science curricula, 3 major international organizations came out with a large statement last year, which not every department follows, but some integrate it into their curricula. And within the IEEE, ACM, AAAI framework is the idea of embedding these ethical, reasoning, and socio-emotional skills, including learning about the workplace, directly into the computer science curriculum. Again, that learning about the workplace has been part of ABET standards for a long period of time. The Chips and Science Act now sort of ups the ante when it comes to responsible conduct of research training for anyone from postdoctoral students up. Right? And the way in which it ups the ante is it basically says, especially if you're doing ML-based research, you'll need to be able to think about the human and social impacts of that research. You probably know, IRB boards have not even been concerned with those things in the past. They said there's a specific clause within the Common Framework from 1976, which says, basically allows ML research to occur without any consideration of human impact, right? But, however, there's a movement in the direction of saying, no, ML research as well may have, just the research itself may have human impact, although you're never asking anyone any direct questions like you might in a psychology experiment. And so the Ethics and Society Review Board came about at Stanford. It was just an experiment for about 3 or 4 years where they promised ML researchers more money if they would go through an Ethics and Society review, but I believe it's now transitioning into a requirement of all that research. So a motion in the direction basically of requiring AI and ML research to have considered it, in the way that I suggested before, the ethical and social ramifications of the work that researchers are doing. Right? Now, you may have heard from colleagues of yours in the field about many different methods that universities out there are using in order to intervene with their computer science students and embed some ethics into their education. I'm going to go through these different methods and basically place them on the landscape of the journey that I talked about before, right? What are these methods and where might they fit well and less well within the journey that a computer science student is taking? If you want I listed some pros and cons of each of these to help you if you're interested in any of these, help you consider whether it's appropriate for your classroom. And those pros and cons are listed on today's handout. Right. So if you wanted to look along, you can take that QR code there and follow along with what at least my assessment of the pros and cons of these frameworks are. You might have heard, I forgot to capitalize the CS at the end of embedded ethics there. You might have heard of the branded program Embedded Ethics, right? Which was in fact invented, it's got to be 6, 7 years ago now, I'm going to say 8 years ago now, at Harvard, a cooperative arrangement between, I think, James Mickens in the computer science department and Alison Simmons in the philosophy department. I suspect others were involved. Started at Harvard, but then was adopted really quickly thereafter at Stanford by a guy named Rob Reich. And boom, Stanford has no problem funding things. So they expanded huge, embedded ethics. Embedded ethics basically uses cases, and you remember I already gave a little criticism of cases. They're a good starting point for a student, but they don't actually get you towards responsible innovation. And it uses ethics lectures, right? And I can tell you from 22 years in front of the classroom, as I look at my students' faces during the ethics lectures, these may not be the most popular things in the world. So by using cases and ethics lectures, they wanted to intervene with their students and give them some more experience, some more education on how to responsibly innovate. It was quickly adopted, I think, at the University of Toronto first. Georgetown does it through their ethics lab. They just got a big grant down there for this type of stuff. University of San Diego has it. University of Nebraska-Lincoln has it, and so forth. Now, one thing I would urge you to take a look at if you want an amusing read, at least sociologically amusing read, is this article in the Harvard Crimson about embedded ethics from last year. I'm not going to stand up here and say that student publications are in any way a beacon of truth. But the thing about it is that this student article, actually, I've been having conversations with everybody out there for quite some time. The student article actually reflects the things that the philosophy professors, the philosophy postdocs, the computer science professors, and many of the students have been saying about the program itself, about some of its shortcomings, about what would be needed to make the program work particularly well. Now, this slide is an example of why the DoD banned PowerPoint. There's no way to make sense of this during a talk, but this is in part for later. It summarizes some of the arguments that I've heard from many people and some of the arguments that are made in that Harvard, that Crimson Magazine piece, right? Some of the things that people say. Label cases are really just too easy, right? Like you look at something that already happened, it's obvious how it went wrong, and they can be too leading, right? So in particular, students don't appreciate being underestimated, as I said there, right? In how you present the case study, right? And they encountered this problem, I think, early on at Harvard, and they've done a lot more to go beyond it at Stanford. In how you present the case study and how you label the harm done, you may in fact be telling the student, I use this type of philosophy, or I think about the world in this way, and etc. And students are nothing if not good mind readers about what they want their professors to say. So you may not actually, you may be getting exactly the outcome you want in the classroom. They're labeling, they're judging, they're condemning, or whatever it is that you want them to do in this instance. But they walk out of the classroom and they're like, whatever. Right? It was just an exercise that we did. And it's true, cases are okay, right? Because those who don't remember history are doomed to repeat it. So you should teach cases, but you know, history doesn't often repeat itself exactly. It rhymes, but it doesn't repeat itself exactly, as I said earlier. So how can you transition students towards unlabeled cases so that they have the foresight to see from this new technology what might go wrong? The ethics lectures in embedded ethics almost universally aren't required of the students, and there's no assignments, right? So I think I remember being no, actually I forget. But I remember being a student. I know what signal that sends. I probably would have showed up just to be nice, right? But the students don't take these very seriously, right? And let's be honest about it. I've given many ethics lectures in my life. They have not been shown to change students' positions on any issue ever in any study done by any psychologist. And I was really sad about this when I started to learn about these in 2013, 14, 15, and then I realized, oh, well, that's never what I had been teaching. I've been teaching them to read, write, reason well. And so what you can show is that ethics lectures and assignments do, in fact, improve use of information and other sorts of things, right? But it may be the case that the student is just better at using information to back up the same thing that they believed before they started their class in late August, right? But they're better using information, right? Once I learned this, I basically started transitioning away from it and using new methods, one of which I'll talk about soon. Students, it seems, have a hard time seeing how philosophy concepts translate into programming choices. You saw where that fell on our student life cycle. And, right, assigning responsibility to engineers, saying Zuck was bad, right? Doesn't tell anybody who goes out and works for Meta on day 35 how they're supposed to stand up to their boss when they think something is going terribly wrong within the company, okay? So what do we need more on top of embedded ethics? We need further anticipation, integration with skills, and as I labeled it there, behavioral learning. So what goes further in this direction? There's a lot of work on this, but I think this is very readable and I think a good paper. You can tell me later if you don't believe it is. It's out of the University of Utah, the shortest path to ethics in AI, an integrated assignment. If you look at the whole landscape of assignments that are being given out there in computer science classes that attempts to integrate social or ethical reasoning into them, you see two approaches. Now, it might be the standard assignment that had previously been given, but along with that, there's a request for a 300 or 400 word essay that explains how that solution might affect a user who had these needs or interests and so on and so forth. So ethical reflection on computing choices. Those are sometimes graded, sometimes not graded. Not graded has all the drawbacks of not being graded, right? But you know, I think that's a great step in a good direction. And for you know, for some of your courses, you may want that to be the way that you go, right? Just to reflect upon the solution that you chose. Right? I guess one of the things I failed to say about embedded ethics earlier is also that the lecture takes up one of a precious few. They have longer semesters than us, so for us it would be even more precious few. The ethics lecture takes up one of precious few lectures during the course of the semester, right? So if the students aren't even going, and then they walk out of it being like, I was just there to make Professor Sims happy, right? Well, then they could have learned a technical skill during the course of that time, and nobody wants to send anybody out into their job at Meta with fewer technical skills, just with more behavioral ethical skills.
It's less of a problem now that the students aren't going to the regular lectures either.
Oh, okay. Oh, good, so I'm not the only one. So integrated ethics attempts to give a little bit more incentive and a little bit more push at level 1. I think it's a pretty good idea. Some ethics reflection, probably better if that reflection is graded in some way. And you know, where they have this, they often have postdocs or graduate students from a philosophy department or something like that, helping those types of assignments. But maybe even more important is computing assignments that embed ethical choices. Now, it would be the height of arrogance for me to stand up here and explain this assignment to you. To the extent that I can understand it, I think it rather clever. And my position going forward would basically have me in a position to help you if you wanted to develop one of these sorts of assignments, right? So this is a graph search assignment, which is stated basically in terms of a different optimal route, right? Rather than just optimizing across the lowest cumulative path, you're asked to optimize Jesse's choices and the risk that he or she is taking as he or she moves between these cities. So the question becomes, is shortest path the right cost function considering the optimal route for Jesse from city A to city B? Why or why not? Right? There may be random moments where Jesse experiences these life-threatening symptoms. And then please describe an alternative cost function. And again, to the extent that I understand the assignment, I think I do. I think what's really cool about it is at this point in the course, students have learned only about accumulation, but not bottleneck problems. So they were actually being able to ask to expand their technical contemplation as well as their ethical contemplation. Could you think of an alternative cost function that might be appropriate here? In other words, could you think of skills that you need to solve this? And then, of course, you would move on to those skills, right? And then there is a rubric, which the students are given, right? And the technical knowledge comes first. That's appropriate. That's got to be the case. But consideration of the human factors and how technical decisions respond to the human considerations is part of that rubric as well. And then the last option, and it may be last in the life cycle, I like this option because I do it here on campus. I came up with it. But this last option is really sort of last in the student life cycle in some ways. And it's what I have called here on campus agile ethics. A freshman student of mine wrote the code that you see out there. I cannot vouch for it. But that's the logo that we use. But to the extent that I've shown it to people for some computer science faculty whose classrooms I have been in doing these role plays, agile ethics role plays that I'm about to explain to you, they said, wait a minute. Like, so in the role play, you walk them through bad choices, right? You actually walk them towards an unethical outcome. And yes, I do, right? We actually walk them through real cases, presenting them the real technical choices, unlabeled, that engineers face. And you would be surprised how many of them, as they're asked to come up with reasons, there's a lot of it's very participatory, there's Google Docs.
Sandbagging.
Pardon me?
You're sandbagging them.
To make them aware of potential pitfalls, correct? Sandbagging, I guess, right? But it has a huge effect in a lot of ways, and especially for these reasons, right? Okay, again, the DoD banned slides like this, right? But what is agile ethics? It's always a real story. Sometimes it's a mishmash of two real stories. I've got one that's about the Germassist algorithm that Google Health created, right? They discovered that people were using reverse image search on their phone to try to get diagnoses of lesions on their skin. And of course, you know about both phones and algorithms. They knew that would underperform for people with darker skin tones. But as they tried to come up with algorithms to remediate for this, they had a bunch of options in front of them. The paper on this just came out a couple weeks ago. Gosh, what did they call I'll remember in a second if I can, what they call the framework for solving this HEAL, A-G-A-L, right? These are the considerations you should go through. But they had an ethical choice. That's one of the role plays that students go through. They go through the creation. I just did one in Sarah Jane Leslie's machine learning course yesterday about taking their basic knowledge of machine learning that she had taught them and trying to create a multi-class classifier and running into all the problems of bias and privacy that people have run into before with multi-class classifiers, right? So it's always a real story. We also run through the role plays really fast, right? In a low information environment, they have the technical skill, but they're not given a lot of cues about what might come next. There are always some cues about what might come next, that they might want to consider X, or they might want to consider Y, but they have to make their decisions like you would in an agile framework, right? You're at a stand-up meeting. You got to say what you've done, say what you intend to do, get feedback, you have your direction for the day. So they got to make decisions really quick about what to do. There are emerging problems in each sprint in the game. It's competitive. We built a voting framework that plugs right into Canvas, in which students can vote for the options, and then it's not going to be revealed how individuals voted later, but how the group in the aggregate voted. And they're under real workplace pressures. So I might walk over to a student during one sprint of the game, drop a card in front of them that says, actually, you have a kid that's about to start college, and your only concern is that the stock price be high 3 weeks from now when you get another vest, right? And so you're looking for a quick patch that's going to keep the New York Times from reporting this story, right? And then they go look down at the card and go, oh, shit. Right? So they know what they have to argue in that round, and that seeds the argument, and we'll see if others accept it, right? So stock incentives, performance reviews, right? There was a personal friendship between the CEO of the company and one of the engineers yesterday. They were both being told repeatedly, you can't disagree with each other, even though your other incentives push you in another direction because you're each trying to stay friends, right? This is stuff like this. Your ordinary workplace stuff. All of it comes from research in organizational psychology. What are the biggest barriers to ethical decision making? People have defined roles on an agile team, so even if they've never had an internship before, they'll know a little bit of something about what a product owner is, a project manager, a business analyst, et cetera, et cetera. And then the audience all has defined stakeholder roles. They are the board, they are writers for Wired magazine, they're end users of the product, and they also get their say, throwing sticky notes up on an electronic whiteboard that's in front of the room, and as the engineers are watching it, they also are like, right? It seems like the end users don't like the direction that we're headed with this. So with that, I'll stop. That's the life cycle that I have in mind. These three options come from, again, from a large scoping project where I've looked at how this is done at universities across the country. I'm not recommending that anybody adopt all of these. You teach computing, not ethics, but some of these can be done alongside computing courses, can take up perhaps a little time in a computing course, can be done in a precept, can be done as an optional outside exercise, etc. And this looks like the landscape of how it's being done out there. It might have run 4 or 5 minutes long, but if you have any thoughts or questions, brickbats, rotten tomatoes.
Hi, this was great. And do you have thoughts on how you approach this differently for graduate students versus undergraduate students? Postdocs?
Yes. Yes, I do. It's largely an undergraduate design. You identify that well. So if you're looking at postdocs, I don't think you want to assume that they are unaware of agile roles or what have you. So here's an example. Actually, Friday, I'm doing this with a bunch of lawyers and a bunch of people who were previously part of the big companies, Meta and so on and so forth. Tim Chubber is going to be there, and et cetera. And we totally overhauled it. So now the information is more obscure, and it is quite laden with little technical hints about what might go wrong in this sprint. It's laden with little hints that the lawyers might glom onto, and we tried to complicate it in a lot of ways. Right? So it's very uncertain. This company, it's a company called DIM, Design in Motion, who has a leading smartphone called Blueberry. And being a Canadian, I'm gonna actually really enjoy contemplating the demise of research in motion over the course of it. But it's full of more technical choices and et cetera. And so we hope it's going to engage them at a level that's appropriate to them. Hope that answers the question.
So one thing I heard about as an indication while you were talking is that you are a person who goes into other classes and runs these on behalf of professors. Is that correct?
Professionally, in the sense that CITP is bringing, I guess I should have prefaced there, CITP is bringing me in next year. Simon has generously supported that to basically be there to do this with you. It's now my job.
Okay. Many of my students in classes focus more on the design aspects of things. They work on things like designing a programming language or designing a protocol, which is very unlikely to have the sort of you've got 3 days to fix it later. Do you have any thoughts as to how to do this kind of integration when there isn't that time pressure aspect to motivate the process?
Yeah, so I think not all these things are appropriate for every classroom. So it might be contemplating more how the themselves can engage them in ethical or social reflection. It may be just taking a minute or two, 5 minutes, 10 minutes during the course of some class to look at an instance of the particular technology that you're developing, how it might have gone wrong in the past, and et cetera. So, does that help?
Yeah, it'll be a challenge. It's programming. It'll be a little bit hard to find obvious instances, but I'm sure they're out there.
Yeah. Yep. And I guess then my position moving forward, should you choose to accept it, my position moving forward would be to kind of like sit with you and work with you and surface these instances that you could use, that you could work on in your classrooms.
So one of the things you mentioned in the beginning of the talk it's something that I think a lot of us observe is that very often when you do these types of things and you tell students we're doing an ethics thing, students will like participate in this exercise, but they'll like think about it as just an exercise and then they'll leave the classroom and forget about it. So one thing that I wanted to ask if you have any thoughts of do you have any ideas on how to implement these types of exercises, but without telling the students that they're an exercise in ethics? So like they're doing an assignment or doing something as part of the class, but they're actually thinking about ethics, but you only tell them that they're doing something about ethics after they're already like, they went to the exercise. They're not thinking about this as an ethical exercise. They're thinking about this as this is just a normal, class exercise.
Yeah, I mean, for the most part, I don't even tell people that I do ethics. Once I've stepped across Nassau Street, I might say responsible innovation, but I don't say ethics. I have no particular investment in the words. You could even leave responsible out and just say, this is an exercise in learning about how the profession operates. This is an exercise in optimizing over two criteria at once, right? Both a cost function and another somewhat more ineffable social function. The lessons are the same.
I was wondering, how do you, what is a thought process you would recommend to like figure out, whether a class is appropriate for some ethics inside of it, or what is a first conversation with you, how to decide whether to have a first conversation with you, something like that.
Yeah. Do you like coffee? Then have a first conversation.
So I happen to not like coffee, but.
Yeah, I mean, I think that if you're 125, which occurs during the summer, and 126, and so on, so if you're early in the cycle, I don't think you want to take up. This is where I think embedded ethics goes wrong. I don't think you want to take up an entire lecture, because you've got to ramp them up far enough that they can do a 200-something course in the same thing, and you want to push the students through. So you might want to do smaller interventions in those courses, have them be in the precepts, figure out another way to do it. You want to push those professional skills through, and you can't have them failing out of 226 because they got 11/12 of 126. But the smaller interventions can grow into bigger ones. And as you were saying, it also depends partly on what your students are doing. If you do want to have them contemplate what the culture of Silicon Valley is like, there was a course this year that involved EA, I think. If you're doing some of that already, then maybe one of the role plays is appropriate. Does that help?
Yeah, so as a follow-up question, does that mean you think that for probably most course material, probably it's worth reaching out to you, or is there some different kinds of course material that is easier for you to interact with or harder for you to interact with because it's more distant from the kinds of activities you have in mind?
I guess my answer to that would be this, is that I spent a lot of years scoping this, and like I said, working with the Google people on their moral imagination thing. And I'm going to have a great answer to your question in 4 years. And so have a conversation with me now. If you can spare the 45 minutes, have a conversation with me now, and we'll both come to some sort of conclusion on that. I'm not afraid to say that I currently understand this stuff, but have practiced only one of these methods.
Yeah, thanks.
Sorry, one more question. What can we as faculty do to signal to our students that this part of the class is really important? Saying things like, this part of the class is really important, seems to have the opposite of its intended effect.
Yeah, there's an example in that article from the Crimson, Real or Fabricated, in which the professor apparently said, after midterm, you have a treat. It's an optional lecture on ethics, right? That's strong signal not to come, right? So, and yeah, right, like being too straightforward is not right, but attaching some grade to it, attaching some extra credit to it, something like that. That's
Actually, we put an ethics question on a final exam in a 200 level course, but it was a pretty easy ethics question.
Yeah, it could be that. There's gonna be a question on the final exam about this lecture, right? But again, lectures, like, I'm not recommending lectures necessarily. They have computing skills to learn, and if they can spell Immanuel Kant, that's enough for me. They don't need to hear a lecture about Immanuel Kant. Other interventions are sometimes more appropriate.
Yeah, my version of that was if they know how to pronounce Proust, I'm good.
Yeah. Well-rounded education.
All right, let us thank Stephen. Let's treat this as.
Getting slide again?
With the
With all the QR codes.
Yeah.
sure.
Despite the fact that this is so important, let's try to actually build on it as opposed to the other way around.
So is the plan to distribute this material?
Oh, that's not the right.
That's not the.
So
I'll send these PowerPoints. to you.
So this handout actually went out in the email announcing the faculty meeting. The slides we can make available.
Good.
Thanks.
Very good.
Thank you.
We have just a couple of other kind of announcements and quick discussions. If everybody would kind of hold on, let me stop the recording.